All right. Well, I'm going to give a extremely quick welcome to everybody, and then I'm quickly going to turn it over. So welcome, everybody. I'm Sarah Gottlieb. I'm one of, can't remember how many, 5 or 6, I guess, core team members of the North America regional network of the Conservation Coaches Network. So thank you, everybody who is in that group that's joining us for the first time in a long time. We have been meeting and making plans and have all just been very busy with various things, but we've been wanting to put together another informational webinar for everyone. And this particular topic of decision science, which is new to many of us, probably to many of you, came up and we thought it would be of interest. So I'm glad we were able to put this together. And Doug, I think, will provide a better introduction to our speaker and our topic, but I just wanted to welcome everybody. And I'm supposed to give some network updates, but I'm not really sure that I have any other than this webinar today will be followed by another one on the topic of monarch butterfly conservation. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully we'll soon be sending out a webinar time and link. So keep an eye out for that. The coaches rally, which would have been held this spring, I think many of you hopefully are aware, is currently being rescheduled for next fall in the same location. Obviously, that will be pending whatever happens with the pandemic and efforts to get it under control and vaccines. But for now, that is still on. So keep an eye out for information to come on that from CCNet more generally. And I know there's a few of you that I personally invited from a partnership group I work with that are not part of the Conservation Coaches Network. So thank you. Thanks for bearing with us. And I hope everybody finds today's topic to be of interest. So I'll turn it over to Doug to introduce the speaker and the topic for the day.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. And I do want to remind folks that we are recording this session, just so you know. And also, if you're not speaking, could you put yourself on mute? If you're not already on mute, there was a little background noise. So today I have the pleasure of introducing David Martin, a colleague with us. He is an applied decision scientist with the Nature Conservancy's Maryland and DC chapter. And his interests are in environmental decision making and how the process can be transparent, informative, and effective. He has a background in water quantity and quality management with a bachelor's of science and a master of natural resources from Virginia Tech and a PhD in ecology from Colorado State University. I first met David just about a year and a half ago, I guess, when he agreed to join a session I was co-organizing for the IAGLR annual conference in 2019 in Brockport, New York. So he was one of the speakers in our session. At the time, he was a research scientist with US EPA's Office of Research and Development in New England. And he gave an excellent talk then on decision analysis as a process for linking human values to wetland restoration. So it was a session really focused on values provided by coastal wetlands, and he provided a nice kind of framing talk. So when he's not thinking about or talking about decision science, he enjoys raising 2 young boys in Bethesda, Maryland. And today, David is going to provide us with his insights regarding integrating trade-off analysis into conservation planning. So this is obviously a topic of interest. We have now, I think, 43 people on, which is a great turnout. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, David. And let me know if you have any, it's pretty easy to share your screen, but feel free to do so.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm relatively new to Teams compared to Zoom, but I think I'll be able to work this out. Can everybody see that? I can't see you, so you're gonna have to say something.
Yes.
Okay, are you seeing my presentation mode or my notes mode?
Presentation mode.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. We've worked out the technical glitches. Appreciate the introduction, Sarah and Doug. Happy to be here. I couldn't look at all the participant list. I couldn't find it on the Teams screen, but I appreciate everyone's time and attention and hearing me today. I'll be speaking about trade-off analysis in particular, being explicit about trade-offs. And Doug, I'll try to pause at least once during this discussion and we can field any questions from the chat box. All right, so let's just start off with a definition and get it out of the way. Trade-offs are amounts of something that a decision maker will give up to gain specified amounts of something else. Now, this definition is pretty short and sweet, but the concept has several distinct features. First, it assumes that trade-offs are properties of more than one possible option or decision, defined in terms of more than one possible value or interest. Second, it assumes that it is impossible to achieve the best value or the best level of all of your values or interests in a decision. In other words, you can't have it all. Now, I am going to quickly give you an illustration, an example of trade-offs, using something hypothetical, a hypothetical conservation planning scenario. And let's say that we are interested in evaluating two conservation options in terms of cost on the x-axis and number of bird species saved on the y-axis. Now, we've determined that option A will cost $50,000 to implement and yield a number of 50 in terms of bird species saved. Option B will cost $100,000 to implement and yield a number of 70 in terms of bird species saved. Now, I don't have the polling capabilities of Teams, but I would ask you to ponder these for a few seconds, and if you want to use chat, that's fine. If not, just think, which option would you choose, A or B? And don't think hard about it. Okay. Thank you. Somebody's answering. All right. I appreciate your consideration, but let's take a look at these options in a matrix. Now, there's nothing new here. We've just organized the options on the left-hand side in the rows, defined by these criteria that we're evaluating them along the columns on the right. Instead of looking hard at these numbers, let's implement a very well-known method for computation called return on investment. It just so happens that the return on investment is higher for option A than it is for option B. Now, I've scaled these numbers here so that they are easily read instead of you reading a ton of decimal points, but just know that option A has a higher return on investment than option B. So the question is, what happened with those of you who chose option B? Are you wrong? No, definitely not. You made a value-based judgment, which is completely fine. So some believe that composite measures like return on investment and cost effectiveness can resolve some of the problems of complexity. And indeed, if this table were a large multidimensional data set, we'd want to have some tools to synthesize information. However, computation doesn't necessarily help us be better decision makers. In this example, simply agreeing on the highest computed ROI doesn't enhance our abilities to deliberate and reason with ourselves or with our partners or stakeholders involved in a decision. And importantly, it doesn't provide us with the opportunity to be explicit about trade-offs before converging on a priority option or decision. So we're talking about real trade-offs here. Should we condense them into a ratio or actually talk about them? And this is where the fields of decision analysis come into play. One deliberative tool, which is very easy to initiate discussion here, is a value trade-off. I could ask, is it preferable to double our investment for a 40% increase in potential impact? If the answer is yes, for any reason, then a return on investment approach simply won't work because you would prefer option B over option A, which again is completely fine. And the point here is that you are making the value-based judgment based on whether or not you place higher emphasis on one consequence or another. Decision-making can result from your thinking or others and not be a result of computation. And so what I'll be discussing today is just a way to think through decisions. Now you have a smattering here of different book titles and different ways to call it. It can be called common sense, really. And they're all including many studies of how humans can and do make decisions. They emerged from other fields like statistical decision theory, operations research, behavioral psychology, so on and so forth. And they're all being used to address the behavioral limitations of decision makers and safeguard against our biases or other factors that cannot be adequately evaluated in a hard decision. So today I will talk about strategy selection. I'll give a case study example, which is contained in the planning phase of open standards or conservation standards. And it's also contained in the mapping strategies and places phase of Conservation by Design 2.0. It's important to note that there are many decision-focused concepts and tools that may be applicable to other phases of these frameworks. And I could give other case studies and inform those concepts and tools at other meetings if you wish. So there's two main approaches for explicitly deliberating trade-offs. One is intuitive, and it basically just focuses on key discussions about trade-offs in your decision. Whereas the other is more quantitative, and it requires a facilitator to summarize information on decision maker preferences and organizing that into a quantitative measure for comparing options or decisions. Without going into these approaches, I'm going to quickly go over some current approaches that I have found in practice that I want to discuss real quick. This is an evaluation table. You can call it a consequence table or a payoff matrix, whatever. This is provided from our friends at Foundations of Success, and it is a guidance. It is taken from a guidance manual dated last year, 2019. So you see here a strategy evaluation table. On the left-hand side are a number of strategies, A through G, and they are evaluated on a set of criteria: potential impact, feasibility, and niche/gap. Now this approach is to rank the set of strategies per criterion and to sum the ordinal ranks for each strategy across the criteria into a total score here on the right-hand side. An alternative table that was provided to me by Sarah Gottlieb. Earlier this year, we spent a week with several of you in Georgia at a Conservation by Design workshop. And in this strategy evaluation table, it's set up very similarly. On the left-hand side, you have a set of strategies. They are defined by multiple benefit, feasibility, cost, and risk criteria. And in this table, I believe that they developed constructed scores for each criterion. I think between 0 and 11 or 1 and 11, doesn't really matter. And then they added the scores across the criteria per strategy into a total value. In both of these examples, practitioners are making a simplified prediction of how they think the strategies compare to one another, expecting some to be better than others based on evidence or expert opinion. This slide will go over a couple of potential issues with these two approaches in the context of evaluating trade-offs. The first possible limitation is with the concept of expectation. And Hugh Possingham loves to ask, what is 2 meters plus 3 kilograms? What is 4 hours minus $100? What is a 50-50 chance plus 7 species? And what he means is that just because the numbers are on the same scale doesn't mean that they are comparable. In the case of ordinal rankings, such as you see here, I could ask a very simple question. How does the difference between the first and the second ranked strategy with respect to potential impact compare to the difference between the first and the second ranked strategy with respect to feasibility? That question cannot be answered because practitioners do not know what ordinal rankings really represent. Ordinal measures only tell us that one strategy or option is better than another. It doesn't tell us by how much. So we need interval level or ratio level indications of value in order to understand anything about predictions or preferences. So we're missing the value measurement component here. The second possible limitation has to do with the range of values. The greater the possible variation from some expectation, the more our decisions should account for that range. And you can view this in the other table here. I'm going to toggle and show and highlight with 2 boxes the first benefit criterion and cost criterion here. Notice how the range of values are between 6 and 11 across the strategies with respect to the benefit criterion, and between 2 and 11 across the strategies with respect to the cost criterion. Now, should this variation make a difference? Yes, it absolutely should. And you can even describe this using a value trade-off that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. Is a 5-point swing in benefit equally preferable to a 9-point swing in cost? If the answer is no for any reason, then simply summing the scores across the criteria won't work. So in short, people should know about what they are scoring, and the same goes for ordinal ranking there. The third potential limitation is that summing requires conditional independence of the criteria. And this is the double counting phenomenon. We don't want to count the same interest more than once, and values of one criterion should be unaffected by changing levels of another. And there's no way to safeguard against this phenomenon with ill-defined criteria and potentially ambiguous scoring and ranking. So I want to mention that scores, really constructed scores, are not a problem per se, as long as they are meaningful, descriptive, and indicate the degree to which the associated criterion is preferred across strategies. It has to be a within criterion evaluation, basically. But this is where decision-focused theories and methods become useful. And the quantitative elicitation types of approaches can be contained within a discipline known as multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA. And there's over 60 years worth of theory and methods contained in this field that I don't have time to go into, but I'll mention 3 of the most popular categories of approaches. One is called a value function approach, and this explicitly uses value measurement theory in its axiomatic foundation to overcome the limitations of that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so an example is the SMART approach. This SMART approach stands for Simple Multi-Attribute Rating Technique, and it basically takes criteria values that are apples versus oranges, transforms them into a common currency so that they can be compared, assigns weights to the criteria, and performs some weighted average aggregation to approximate an overall worth or value for each strategy. This is probably the most popular approach around the world, certainly in North America. The analytic hierarchy process is another one worth mentioning. It is also a value function type of approach. It has a different axiomatic foundation, but if I were to say, if not the second, then it's one of the most popular. throughout the world, definitely internationally. It's a very interesting approach. It has a very interesting foundation way to elicit information from decision makers. It has a mathematical elegance to it. So it's very interesting, but a definite alternative to value function approaches, not a complement. And the third, those first two are ranking approaches. The third one, the third category rather, are outranking approaches. And I have found outranking approaches to be very useful to explain and implement with decision makers. And you're basically not looking to estimate an overall score for each strategy across criteria, but you're looking at the differences of the criteria values in pairs and coming up with sort of discriminating thresholds for those values to pick apart how some strategies might be better than others or outrank others. So it doesn't come up with a total final ranking for the strategies, if you will. I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions.
So David, there is one question coming in from the chat from Nick. And you made the statement that practitioners, I think you said, can't learn or don't understand what ordinal ratings mean. So can practitioners not learn?
What the ordinal rankings mean?
Yeah, what do they mean?
Well, ordinal rankings only mean that one is better than another, right? So something is going on in practitioners' heads to determine a ranking. And we can't not know what that is.
But this is Nick. That's the entire foundation of economics is ordinal choice. And this basket of goods is better than that basket. And so as long as you know the limitations, I don't see why it's a problem.
Well, based on the information in the basket, you are able to make that choice, right? So there is some value associated with the characteristics of those baskets or whatever factors are involved in distinguishing your preference ordering of the baskets. So yes, in economic theory, having a preference ordering, one is better than another, is absolutely, a foundation. But when we look at criteria, if one criterion is ranked one way, we don't know what information is involved. This is how criterion is, or how strategies are ranked, I guess, for another criterion. So there's just a lack of value-based information in how we measure those values that ordinal ranking doesn't provide any representation for. And I'm sorry if that is not as clear as it could be, but I would love to chat with you.
No, it'd be great. It'd be great to have a longer conversation because I certainly agree. I totally agree with you. There's total limits to ordinal ratings, and just knowing when they're useful and when they're not is I think the question.
Absolutely. And that slide, the limitation slide, was specific for evaluating trade-offs. So there's sort of an elegance to how to look at a table, like an evaluation table, and the different consequences of our actions or choices, and understanding that the variations in those measures are representative of trade-offs. That cannot be found using ordinal rankings in general. And I'll just reference really quick that Eddie Game and Hugh and some others, Peter Kariva, I think, they have a good exposition on this topic in a paper in Conservation Journal. I apologize. I think the title is 6 Mistakes in Conservation Prioritization. And it's mistake number 4 that I'm pinpointing on here. But yeah, let's have a conversation about that sometime. Anything else?
Yeah, so there were no other questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so for the duration of this, I will give a case study. And this case study is with the Nature Conservancy's Chesapeake Bay program. The Chesapeake Bay program has a particular agriculture strategy team I think it's a team consisting of 13 members, and they were tasked with going through a conservation by design process within the past year to come up with some new strategies to implement on ag in-field, within agricultural fields, and on the edge of fields with respect to how to improve upon water quality goals in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, I'm going to skip to the executive summary real quick, and then I'll circle back at the end. There was a set of strategies over here on the left-hand side that were fundamentally evaluated, and they were evaluated to sort of engage agribusinesses, farmers, farm landowners, all to influence nutrient and soil health and stream and wetland restoration activities. A whole slew of strategies were, sort of deliberated at the onset, and then, we converged on about 6 right here on the left-hand side. I don't have time to go into any of them, but I'll draw your attention to the right-hand side, the status. Notice that 3 of the strategies were identified as priority strategies to advance to planning and implementation. 1 strategy at the bottom was identified as not a priority. In other words, it would only be implemented if some of those activities described in the strategies were associated with other strategies as good ideas. And then there were 2 strategies that needed further evaluation. They needed more testing and research, and we may be able to phase those in over time. So that's the executive summary, and I'll circle back to it at the end. This is a screen capture of the systems mapping we performed for the situation analysis. I don't have time to go into it, but I just want to note that we didn't have any team members that were experts in Marathi, unfortunately. I was brand new. I just joined TNC last fall, so I didn't know about the software, and we used something called Plectica. You can access it, go to plectica.com. You can have a free account using your email and a password, and you can access a infinite sort of space and a cloud-based space to do some diagramming. And so we found that this was very helpful because we could all be on our own computers diagramming in the same space at the same time. And so I encourage you to check out Plectica as a useful, potentially useful alternative for your systems mapping purposes. And we generated very simplified results chains using Plectica as well. So this is another screen capture. We took probably 3 to 6 months to sort of be comfortable with the situation analysis and converging on a set of strategies, doing some evidence reviews, so on and so forth, that all link to Chesapeake Bay water quality goals. And so once we had a set of strategies, what do we do with those strategies, right? We can't implement them. They're all good strategies, but we can't implement them all at the same time. So we were prompted by the project manager and sponsor to prioritize them because some should be implemented before others to sort of maximize our impacts. So we developed an evaluation table like the one you see here. This is a screen capture where the strategies are on the left-hand side rows, and they are defined or compared using 11 criteria here. We had 4 impact criteria, 4 feasibility criteria, and 3 risk criteria. Now, I sat with the project manager and project sponsor, and we filled out this table. We took one criterion, and we filled out a written sort of narrative description of how we felt, or how they felt rather, the strategy performed with respect to that criterion. So we had a narrative description for every single, kind of box or cell you see here. Some were easier to fill out than others. And then we looked at the range of descriptions across the strategies per criterion, and then we came up with some sort of like value designation, like red, yellow, green, corresponding to low, moderate, or high value. And we did that because we did that by looking at a couple of strategies and saying, well, there's no more information that we can tell that one is better than another, but we know that, these set of strategies are better than these others. So that helped us distinguish between the low, moderate, and high value. Okay, so what do we do with all this? One way to do it is intuitive, right? We could just ask the agricultural strategy team members to try to jumble all of this information in their head, recognizing that there are trade-offs. One strategy is not better than another across all the criteria. So they could just deliberate with themselves and come up with a final ranking, if you will, of the strategies. I call that a holistic approach. Or they could be engaged in some indirect quantitative analysis where we set aside those strategies and look at the real differences in value across the criteria values and associate preferences on those differences, in other words, the trade-offs contained in the table, and have that type of analysis inform in what I call an indirect ranking of the strategies. And this is obviously would be informed using an MCDA technique, such as a value function. Well, we did both. We implemented a multi-method approach. We did a direct ranking. I asked all of the team members to study the table, study the context of the decision, sort of try to vacillate between all of the trade-offs in their head and come up with a direct ranking. And then I engaged them in a sort of value elicitation approach where they assigned preferences to the differences in the criteria values across the strategies. And this is a weighting exercise. And then we use that to approximate a ranking, indirect ranking of the strategies. And then I showed the results to the participants, and we had a conversation about them. One method is not better than another, but we know that there may be some inconsistencies across methods, right? Between methods, rather. So we looked at those inconsistencies, and we allowed for adjustments in either the direct assessment or the indirect assessment. And then we had a final conversation about the results, and I'll go through a couple of examples here. Okay, this is participant 10, and participant 10's evaluation represented in a figure. So on the x-axis, you see this participant's direct assessment of the strategies, and on the y-axis is the indirect assessment of the strategies. Now the strategies are numbered and color-coded with symbols 1 through 6, and they're sort of plotted in terms of their direct and indirect assessment. So for example, strategy 1 is that triangle there in the middle. It just so happens that this participant's direct assessment of strategy 1 was that it was 3rd in ranking, but in the indirect assessment, it was 4th in ranking. So it was off by 1 order of magnitude, basically, inconsistent by 1 order of magnitude. The dashed center line here represents consistency between both methods. So strategies that actually fall on that consistency line are consistent in their ranking between the methods. So you'll notice that this participant ranked strategies 5 as first directly, but it also happened that strategy 5 ranked first indirectly as well. And then so the point is, how close to the consistency line are these evaluations? And when they're not close, or they are made, they have a significant degree of inconsistency, what's going on there? What factors or biases might the participant be incorporated into either the direct or the indirect assessment? And then we have conversations about that. This participant was very consistent. It's obviously, you're never going to get completely on that consistency line, but this participant was only off by 1 order of magnitude on 2 of the ranks. So it's very consistent. Let's contrast that by a participant who was inconsistent in their rankings. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the initial ranking for participant 1. And it just so happens that it looks like strategy 6 ranked 4th in this person's direct assessment, but it ranked 1st indirectly based on their preferences on those criteria values. Whereas strategy 1 ranked 1st directly, but it ranked 3rd indirectly. So there's some significant, orders of magnitude difference in the two assessments. It just so happened that this participant associated higher preferences to lesser ranking or less important criteria. And this is a common phenomenon that's been identified in weighting and ranking methods for over 60 years. And so once this person saw this and noted or recognized the way that they assigned preferences to those criteria values in the weighting exercise, they adjusted those weights accordingly. And on the right-hand side is their final ranking. So it basically improved their consistency by 3 orders of magnitude. And the plots look more consistent between direct and indirect. This is participant 13's evaluation. On the left-hand side is the initial ranking. Again, strategy 6 ranked 6th or last in this person's direct assessment, but 1st in the indirect assessment. So that's a huge inconsistency that we discussed. And it just so happens in this particular case, this participant was biased. There was some other factors involved in this person's direct ranking that were not incorporated in the evaluation table that the project manager and sponsor helped fill out and prompted the team to evaluate. And some of the, this happened in a couple of instances, which is not a problem. We're always going to have other factors in our head when we are evaluating strategies, but it was good to recognize this in the evaluation. And I think in this person's head, their funding, in the times of COVID was going through this person's head. That wasn't explicitly evaluated in the evaluation table or consequence table. Recognizing this, though, and being prompted to just focus on, the evaluation table and the trade-offs contained therein, this participant changed their direct ranking, and the final ranking on the right is representative of that. So this participant improved their consistency by 3 orders of magnitude. This is the group's evaluation. So I kind of the overall the direct and overall indirect evaluations to come up with these group evaluations. On the left-hand side is the initial ranking. Notice that there are several orders of magnitude different between the direct and the indirect rankings, but we improved consistency in the final ranking by 4 orders of magnitude. And notice here on the bottom left, the top 3 strategies for direct ranking were the same top 3 strategies for indirect ranking, strategy 1, 5, and 6. Strategy 3 ranked last in the direct and the indirect approach, and strategies 2 and 4 were somewhere in the middle. And so keep that in mind, and I'm going to go back to the executive summary and note that the 3 priority strategies that were chosen to advance to implementation were those top 3 ranking strategies in the final prioritization. And the strategy that ranked last, that strategy 3, I think, was the one that was identified as not a priority. And those 2 in the middle were those 2, I think 2 and 4, strategies 2 and 4 were identified as needing further evaluation. So everything I've talked about today, the elicitation, going back and showing the results and getting more information from them, these all were useful talking points when we all got back in together in plenary to discuss the strategies and associate a status to them. And the project sponsor and manager were intrigued by the analysis, and one of them thought that the indirect approach was actually a better gauge of participants' values and potentially guarded against any bias that was in the direct assessment. So I thought it was a very useful, or it provided insights, rather, to how they were going to evaluate these strategies. It was a consistent way to do it across 13 team members, provided all of them with a voice, and it provided for useful discussion. So in summary, the goal is to solve the problem, right? That is, provide insights into making an informed choice. Often that involves explicitly evaluating trade-offs. And there's a wide variety of analytical tools to help us in this endeavor. But the key is to understand our biases and assumptions that go into such an analysis. And that's all I have. And thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to engage with you now.
David, thank you for that very illustrative case study. And there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll read those and then maybe we can open it up. From John Morrison, can you describe how the conversations went when discussing the differences between direct and indirect ranking to get to the final ranking? What kind of questions were you asking?
Great question. First of all, I took off my shared content. Can we all see each other now, or do you still see my content?
We can see you. Yep.
All right. Great question. So I basically showed them the what I showed you all first, the comparison of the direct and the indirect approach. And then I did a little bit of homework before then because I wanted to know how the preferences on the criteria values were determining the indirect ranking, because that's something that I could do. It's sort of like jumping into the information that I was provided with using the indirect approach. So then I could show them that these are the reasons why, and we looked at the evaluation table. I used the indirect, the information I gleaned from the indirect approach, and then I showed them using the evaluation table why there was evidence provided in their preferences of the weighting that one strategy would be ranking higher than another. However, you said the opposite in your direct approach. So where, what's going on here and what kind of information is limited in either the direct or the indirect approach. And I got responses on both sides. I think I failed to mention that there were probably about half that made some adjustments. Half were pretty consistent. I wouldn't ask them to do anything. I didn't ask the ones who were inconsistent to do anything. In fact, two of the ones that were inconsistent didn't change anything, and they used it as just discussion points to draw out any more factors that should be involved in the strategy selection. But the ones that did change, we looked at whether or not it was the weights or whether or not, there is subjectivity in both approaches. So we just had a fruitful conversation about that.
Thank you.
Yep.
And the next question is from Christina. And you can speak, Christina. I don't need to.
Yeah. Hey, Christina.
Hello. Thanks so much, Dave, for hosting this for us. So I missed how you came about with the sum or the end results, both for the direct and the indirect. I saw the different criteria, but somehow I missed how you roll it up and show people these were, these were the results, just like you have in the summary table where you show the green and the red. Can you remind me of that? I missed that.
Yeah, so that's the value function approach that I didn't go into. It's a quantitative evaluation. You basically transform green, yellow, and red, or whatever. If you actually have measurements, that's great. These were qualitative measurements, so we transformed them into using a linear function. It could be, 0 to 10. It could be -1, 0, 1. It could be 1, 3, 5. It doesn't matter. You can incorporate nonlinear functions as well, but I went over those aspects and assumptions with the project manager and sponsor and how they wanted to evaluate it. And I think the project sponsor just said, okay, a linear function, I don't know, 135 or something was adequate for this purpose, not take too much time on it. And then the weighted averaging is sort of like another whole aspect to it. The weight elicitation is one thing, and then associating those weights as a weighted average function to those scores or values was used. And that was explained.
Thanks.
during
And
the
with the
process.
weighting, sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
And with the weighting, I was wondering, did you use the weighting assigned by individuals, or did they first agree on this is the weighting we're going to assign? It was individual.
Individual.
Okay,
Yeah, Ralph Keeney told me once that he would never aggregate participant weights because we're not talking about multiple voices as one. Each of you has an individual voice, right? So each participant's preferences are valuable in and of themselves. And so when I averaged, or when I showed the group average, that was the average of sort of like the overall value function values. I didn't average any weights or anything. I mean, I have seen people average weights, and that context is fundamentally based on the assumption that you are acting as one group and you have one voice. That's just not the case for our case study.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Kelsey, you're up next if you'd like to come off mute.
I can read.
Whoops.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just, sorry, hit mute twice. I was just going to ask to hear a little bit more about kind of the time and resources that supported this process. Like how many meetings did you all have over what period, and what kind of work did you do in between meetings to make this really successful?
Are you speaking of like the ranking, the strategy selection part, or the whole CBD process up until this point?
The strategy selection specifically.
Right. Yeah, so that went, that took longer to set up than it took to actually perform all the calculations and meet with everybody individually. I would say 2 months, ballpark. The first month you're getting with people and you're trying to come up with a set of good criteria to compare the strategies. And you're going to have different definitions. You're going to look at different criteria. You're going to get rid of some criteria. And then you're also going to score those strategies on the criteria. And sometimes doing that, some logical ordering or combination of different activities within strategies happen. So in other words, when we were just looking at evaluating the strategies, we tended to combine 2 or 3 strategies into one that was more reasonable to evaluate than a separate set. So that all takes some time. And then you have me as a facilitating the rest of it, had to just set up the spreadsheets, meet with individual participants to talk about the instructions of the direct and indirect assessment, have one maybe 30-minute or so meeting after their assessment, and then maybe multiple meetings. I had one participant changed their direct ranking, I think twice, or their indirect ranking twice. I don't remember, but that that'll take about a month, I guess, depending on everybody's schedules. So yeah, thanks.
I have one question. There are no other questions in the chat, but one question I had is when you, the 2 strategies that were rated as needs further evaluation, was that in any way a result of the inconsistency between the direct and indirect for those strategies, or was it because, for example, the team understood that there are evidence gaps that they really needed to explore?
Great question. I actually think it's both. I mean, I can't say for sure that our direct and indirect sort of strategy prioritization had, a direct influence, but I do remember having the conversation about those 2 strategies in the middle, and the project sponsor saying something like, it's interesting that the team, doesn't feel strongly about them, but there are certain aspects that we just need more information on. So, I mean, I think it did have an influence on both aspects. Yeah.
Nick, feel free to come off mute.
All right, thanks. Hey, David, this is a great presentation. And by the way, CMP has had for a while a kind of a working group that's been staggering along, trying to think about evaluating different strategy rating options. So it'd be great to have you join this group and kind of benefit from everything you're doing here.
Great.
I'll reach out to you on that. One of the things we've been wrestling with is if you look at a lot of the structured decision-making stuff and a lot of the consequences tables and things like that, they often provide examples where you're given 5 different places where you could buy land, or you're given examples of, 5 places for siting some kind of pollution treatment center or something like that. And so those are all kind of different choices, but all for the same intervention point along a theory of change. I think a lot of what we wrestle with in the open standards community is also then, if you have 5 totally different strategies that are different points along a theory of change, where they're not such apples to apples comparisons among the different options. Have you had experience with that, or could you comment on how you might address that?
So do you, for example, maybe you could give me an example, but are you saying that there are multiple strategies that might influence others in the same result chain that are not mutually exclusive?
Correct. Yeah.
So those would be hard to use a value function for, to add up, to add into a total value for each strategy, because it would probably violate the double counting assumption. That doesn't mean that you can't look at an evaluation table or consequence table in using your example to just, try to resolve it and pick a strategy. So I would have to, there are some instances where violating the double counting rule is okay. I can't pinpoint any examples right now, but you're really looking, if you're looking at multiple options to decide on, and they all exist on the results chain, and one needs to be implemented before the other. I can see how I'm like envisioning a theory of change or result chain in my head, different arrows coming in at different ways, and that's fine. They're mutually exclusive. But if one absolutely needs to happen before the other, then I guess we'd have to have a conversation about how that would be evaluated.
Well, it'd be fun to have that conversation. So great.
Yeah, great.
And Kala, I think you're next if you still have a question. Oh, she raised her hand by accident. Well, it's we have a few minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to come off mute. Well, thank you, David. This was a fantastic presentation. Sarah, I don't know whether there's anything else we need to mention before we adjourn.
No, nothing in particular on my mind. If anybody is on this call who is not already on the email list for the North America Regional Network, go ahead and email me, or Doug, or any of the other leaders of the network would be happy to get you added. I think there might be a few people in that boat, and you will be updated about the next one of these webinars, as I mentioned earlier, which will be towards the end of January. And thanks so much, David. This was super interesting, and thanks, Doug, for pulling it together.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Too.
Great to see you all.
Everybody.
Bye,
Bye,
guys.
everyone.
Bye.